The big news of the last 24 hours is the announcement of a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement mediated by the Chinese government, which I discussed yesterday in a video on the Duran with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, but which I will return to in certain comments later in this video. But before I reach that point and discuss this truly momentous news, I'm going to return to the traditional topic of this channel, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And once again, we are focused very much on the situation in Bakhmut. Now, before I say that, let me reiterate again, Bakhmut is not the only part of the battlefields in Ukraine where ongoing fighting is going on. The Russians claim over the last 24 hours that they've repelled a Ukrainian counterattack in Crimea, and they continue to claim incremental progress in the area of Avdiivka, which, as I said, seems to be coming in for particularly heavy pounding, and which they are attacking in force. The Ukrainians, for their part, have sought to show that they are still putting up a fight in Avdiivka and Krasnogorovka. Over the last couple of hours, they resumed shelling of Donetsk city from those two towns. So there's a lot of fighting going on in various places. But the main battle continues to be in Bakhmut, and there's been a fair amount of information pouring in over the last 24 hours about the situation in Bakhmut. Now, the first thing to say is that, as I said yesterday, there's been reports that the Wagner organization troops have pushed forward towards the village of Blagodatnoye, that they seem to be extending and enlarging their northern pincer. And there's also been reports that the Ukrainian counterattack, the one that I discussed yesterday, the brief Ukrainian counterattack, which the Ukrainians claim resulted in the Russians being pushed back from the road, the northern road to Bakhmut, that's gone into reverse. The Wagner organization troops pushed back. They pushed the Ukrainian troops back. They're once again, apparently, or so Russian reports claim, and even, by the way, some Ukrainian reports, they're once again extremely close to the road indeed. I've even seen one report which suggests, but does not actually clearly say, that they've actually cut the road, that they're actually on the road itself. But I think that would be pretty huge news, and I'm going to guess that it's not true, because if it was, I expect that by now I would have received a lot more confirmation of it. There's also been renewed fighting in Ivanovka, that the Wagner assault troops have pushed hard towards Ivanovka. That's the southern pincer. And of course, the road that passes through Ivanovka has also been unusable by Ukraine for a long time. And I understand that the weather has indeed changed in this area, and now the ground has become very muddy, making it very difficult indeed for Ukraine to send supplies of men and machines into Bakhmut across the fields and the roads. And this has become apparently very difficult, and of course it's also becoming very difficult to pull out from those roads. By the way, the British Ministry of Defence has tried to turn that round. It's saying that the Russian advances around Bakhmut are similarly impeded by the muddy conditions, and that this is working to the advantage of the Ukrainians. Now, that may be true to some extent. I'm not disputing that it may have actually slowed down the tempo of the fighting. But overall, I have to say that given that Ukrainian troops inside Bakhmut are in operational encirclement, a cauldron, as the Russians like to call it. It's the Ukrainians, it seems to me, who must be having the greater problems as a result of all this mud. And it seems to me that one can't compare the two, and that this is another example amongst many of the British and the Ukrainians trying to counter what they call Russian propaganda by taking Russian memes and reversing them. And I'm going to discuss that briefly later in this program. But anyway, that's what's going on in terms of the two pincer movements. But there's been quite a lot of information that the fighting within Bakhmut itself has been intensifying, with the Wagner organization troops now making significant headway, that they've apparently broken into the central areas of Bakhmut, pushing into these central areas from the north, perhaps also from the south. Some speculate that they managed also to cross the Bakhmutka river from the east, but I've seen no evidence of this. But anyway, there's a lot of fighting apparently going on now in the center of Bakhmut. And that might, by the way, be one reason why the Ukrainians blew up the MiG-17 monument a couple of hours ago, as I discussed in my previous video. It may be that for all the bravado about holding on to Bakhmut to the last man, and despite all the talk about the Ukrainian counterattack, the pending Ukrainian counterattack, that the Ukrainians have themselves been floating, and which has been much discussed, and which I'm also going to discuss in a moment, it may be that in practice, in practical terms, the Ukrainians are skeptical that they can actually break the siege of Bakhmut, and that they've quietly comprehend that the fight for Bakhmut is not going their way, and that the town may soon be lost. But I'm going to discuss that in a moment. I'm just going to say something further about artillery, because Prigozhin is now saying that he has now been provided, that his Wagner troops have now been provided with the artillery they need, the artillery rounds they need. They're fully equipped again. As I said, this has been a long-running, acrimonious saga. I suspect that what is really going on is not that the Wagner forces are inadequately supplied with artillery rounds. It is that they're not getting preferential treatment in terms of artillery rounds, which is, I'm guessing, what they have been receiving for some time. And I think that there's probably some resentment on the part of regular Russian army units that the Wagner forces are getting more and better equipment than they are. And there's been some argument about this, and there's been suggestions that this preferential treatment extended to the Wagner group should be dialed down, and Prigozhin, very protective of the Wagner group and of its fighters, has vigorously pushed back. By the way, on the topic of Prigozhin, he's now made another statement amongst the numerous statements that he makes, in which he appears to anticipate the capture of Bakhmut before long. He appears to think that this battle is indeed coming to an end, and he talks about a significant reorganization of the Wagner group into a somewhat smaller, leaner, even more professional force, one which will no longer be a private military company, apparently, which begs all kinds of questions as to what in that case it will be. But anyway, some kind of reorganization of the Wagner forces once the fight for Bakhmut is won. Anyway, we will see about that. Now, let's get back to the topic of this much mooted Ukrainian counteroffensive. And there's been a great deal of talk about a Ukrainian build-up. There's talk about 19 brigades having been assembled in the area of Bakhmut. 16 of these brigades are said to be infantry or tank brigades, in other words, brigades that would carry out an assault. 3 are artillery brigades. And there's all kinds of claims and calculations about the number of troops in these brigades, and some people have done some rather bold calculations, and they've assumed 3,000 to 4,000 men in each of these brigades, which gives us a figure of around 60,000. Some put it higher, of course, and think it's around 70,000 men, which, by the way, would be an enormous proportion of the Ukrainian army if that were really the case. But anyway, is this actually true? Now, I'm going to make one little point which I think people are overlooking, which is that as I and various other people, Big Serge, the Moon of Alabama, myself, have discussed in the past, it is not unusual for there to be dozens of Ukrainian brigades or brigade-level formations concentrated in and around Bakhmut. At one point, I remember Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama counting 27 brigade-level formations, which is more than the 19 that we're hearing about now. And on another occasion, I think it was Big Serge, he came up with a number of, I think it was 34, even more, in other words, than the number that Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama was talking about. Now, I'm not saying that there hasn't been a Ukrainian build-up. It may be that we're not comparing like with like. I mean, it could be, it might be that the 19 brigades that people are counting are the remnants of the brigades that were previously there, and that people are counting up these brigades and are assuming a Ukrainian build-up, whereas in fact these are the same forces that have been there all along. Or it could be that these are indeed fresh troops, that the older brigades that have been chewed up have been pulled back, and that they've been replaced by fresh brigades from the Ukrainian reserves. I simply do not know. And I think that people who pretend that they do are probably mistaken. I will say this, I seem to recall, and I'm not absolutely certain about this, but I seem to recall previous reports claiming that there were 3 artillery brigades in and around Bakhmut, and that this was the figure that was being touted weeks ago. And if it's still the same figure today, then that suggests that we are perhaps talking about the same artillery units. But, you know, I'm not saying this for certain. I'm also going to further say that assumptions that any Ukrainian brigade is now fully up to strength may be, shall we say, either pessimistic, optimistic, or alarmist, depending on your point of view. Even if these are fresh brigades, it doesn't follow, given Ukraine's recruitment crisis, that it is in fact, that these are in fact fully up to strength brigades. I would have thought that lower figures, perhaps 30,000 men, are more reasonable. Again, this is a guess on my part. I might be completely wrong. Now, will the Ukrainians launch a counterattack in Bakhmut? I believe they will. I think that given the kind of comments that have been pouring out from Kiev, from people like Zelensky and General Syrski about the vital importance of holding on to Bakhmut. It seems to me that some kind of Ukrainian counterattack to either recapture Bakhmut in case it falls over the next few days, or to try to break through the Russian lines and break the siege of Bakhmut. Well, all of that seems to me very, very much on the cards. Will it succeed? But that is an entirely different matter. As I said before, I can't predict that it will succeed. But I will make a further observation again, which is that whenever, over the course of the fighting in Bakhmut, the Russians, the Wagner organization troops, capture some territory, be it Solidar, Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovyevka, or Pitnoye, I've always and invariably read that the immediate Ukrainian reaction to the capture of a lost position is to launch a counterattack. So this would not again be unusual. Maybe the scale of this might be unusual, but we'll just again have to wait and see. But this is a classic tactic that Ukraine would have followed, and of course the Russians know fully that this is what Ukraine might be preparing to do. And in fact, we've now had comments from a Russian official, and the official in question is Abdi Alaudinov, who is commander of the Akhmat Special Forces Unit and deputy commander of the 2nd Army Corps of the People's Militia of the Lugansk People's Republic. He is, of course, a Chechen, and the Akhmat Special Forces Unit is a Chechen unit which has been subordinated to the Lugansk militia, though in practice, as everybody knows, Alaudinov, even though he seems to work very well with the Lugansk militia commanders, basically does his own thing, and his true overall commander is Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the head of the Chechen government. Anyway, this is what Alaudinov said on Friday in an interview with Russia 1 television channel. He said, "We have information that the enemy has assembled 3 groups to stage an offensive. This is in the Bakhmut area. We have taken this note of this information, and we are now preparing to rebuff this attack." And then TASS, where I'm taking these comments of Alaudinov from, goes on to say that according to Alaudinov, the operation to unblock Artyomovsk, in other words Bakhmut, is being planned by NATO leadership. And in Alaudinov's words, a Ukrainian retreat from Bakhmut would represent a loss of face for the enemy, but would not add up to any operational or tactical losses. Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the last point, but anyway, Alaudinov's essential point is that the Ukrainians are preparing a counterattack to try to either break through to Bakhmut or to recapture Bakhmut or to push the Russians back from Bakhmut, all of those things. But the Russians are preparing for it and are busy taking precautions. So some kind of big battle may be on the way. Some people are predicting that it will happen next week. We will see. As I've said already, the conditions are becoming muddy. That may or may not, I'm not an expert in these matters, impede the Ukrainian attack. The Ukrainians will not have large quantities of these new Western machines that they've been provided. There might be a few Leopard 2s if the earlier report of Leopard 2s in Chasiv Yar is true, but apparently they only have 4 of them in total at the present time. So that's hardly a significant number. It doesn't seem as if any of the Bradleys or the Marders will have arrived in this area. So that this will be essentially, again, an infantry force marching into the Russian guns, re-equipped without shells, even according to Prigozhin, using perhaps some armoured personnel carriers, some T-64 tanks, but hardly perhaps the mailed fist that some people are discussing. Now, that's not to say that there's not also been some build-up of NATO-type equipment in and around Bakhmut. There's been a rather interesting development from a technical point of view, and this relates to use by Ukraine of a JDAM bomb. It's a guided bomb near Bakhmut. And here again, I'm quoting, this time from Jan Gagin, one of our regular commentators. He's giving information this time to TASS news agency, and this is the TASS report, and it's again from yesterday, and the TASS report reads as follows: the Ukrainian military dropped a bomb equipped with the US-made JDAM guidance kit in the area of Kurdyumovka near Bakhmut in the Donetsk People's Republic to test the possibility of employing it from Soviet-made aircraft. Jan Gagin, military political expert and advisor to the acting head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic, told TASS on Friday. These are air-launched bombs. Originally, they were made for NATO aircraft. Ukraine has no such aircraft. We believe that this could have been a combat test with a non-standard carrier. This can apply in particular to MiG-29 multi-role fighters. And then it goes on to say the MiG-29 is one of the few aircraft that the Ukrainian military could have used for dropping the JDAM-equipped bomb. Ukraine employs these multi-role fighters for launching HARM anti-radiation missiles. And then TASS provides us with a flurry of media reports from other places. It says Ukraine's Klimenko Time media outlet reported earlier on Friday that the Ukrainian military had employed the JDAM bomb in Donbass for the first time. In its confirmation of this report, the media outlet posted a video clip of the explosion that is spreading on Ukrainian Telegram channels. Neither the Kiev regime nor its military has yet officially confirmed the information of the use of the JDAM bomb. And TASS that goes on to say the business news agency Bloomberg reported in late February, citing sources, that the United States would deliver modified JDAM-ER, Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range Guidance Kits, based on the global positioning system that would make it possible to convert standard air-launched munitions into guided bombs. As Bloomberg specified, the GPS guidance kit is attached to an air bomb weighing from 226 kilos to 907 kilos, and its wing assembly enables the munition to glide towards the target to a maximum range of 72 kilometers. So it's possible that the Ukrainians are going to use some of these kits to launch bombs against targets in Bakhmut, Russian targets in and around Bakhmut. By the way, on the topic of guided bombs, the Russians are responding to the US's decision to provide these guided glide bombs, I believe they are, to Ukraine by bringing into operational use in the conflict area winged guided bombs of their own. So we could be seeing an awful lot more of these winged guided bombs being operated by both sides. I'm going to make a quick observation here. Ukraine has only a limited number of air assets. These are the MiG-29s. They have proved unable to stand up to Russian fighter jets, and like the Sukhoi 35 and the Sukhoi 57 and MiG-31. The Ukrainians have complained that they have some of their MiG-29s have been shot down by long-range R-37 missiles launched by Russian MiG-31 and Sukhoi 57 fighters. So this might be still a tricky operation, even if one allows for the fact that Ukrainian fighters are operating, as I said, considerable distances from the target zones. And of course, the Russian anti-aircraft systems, the S-400 and some variants of the S-300 system, have the capability of shooting down fighter jets and other aircraft hundreds of kilometers from the launch point, as they have actually demonstrated several times in this conflict. So this might not actually be a huge game changer. I'm going to make a further observation, by the way, which is the fact that the United States may be supplying these JDAM bombs, may be a sign, a further sign, that the US is unable to sustain supplies of HIMARS missiles, because I noticed that the range of this glide bomb is actually shorter than that of the HIMARS missile that Ukraine has already been operating in the battlefields since the summer. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. As I said, if I've got this all technically wrong, then people are welcome to come back and comment about it. Whilst I'm on the topic of technical matters in this war, can I also say that one of my most valued commentators, who's somebody with whose background is from India, but that's all I'm going to say about him. I'm simply say that so that he's aware that it is him that I'm taking this information from. He's provided me with a great deal of information about the Patriot missile system, which tends to support the claims, which I've seen, that it might actually have difficulties shooting down drones, maneuvering drones, and some subsonic stealthy cruise missiles. So it might not be quite as effective a system as some imagine, even in this kind of battlefield against those sorts of targets. And the Ukrainian Air Force has categorically denied that it has in fact received a Patriot missile system, as has been claimed by Poland and as has been reported in the some of the some journalistic outlets. And again, I take this from TASS. I find this quite an interesting thing. It says that Ukraine has not yet received a Patriot surface-to-air missile system. A spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Forces, Yuri Ignat, said on Friday, commenting on an article in the Financial Times. At first, we were caught by surprise by the Defense Minister of Poland speaking to the Spanish media Then Financial Times followed suit. No, there has been no Patriot systems in Ukraine. I haven't seen them yet, the spokesman told Ukraine's Rada television channel. Well, who knows what the truth is? That does suggest that there's perhaps some muddle about the Patriot deployments, though I suspect we will see them before very long. Anyway, moving on, whether there's a Patriot system or not, it's increasingly clear to me that the Russians have spooked many Western media commentators and analysts through their heavy use of Kinzhal missiles in the last big missile strike. And there's been a whole cluster of articles conceding that there is no actual defense against the Kinzhal system. Neither the Ukrainians nor the West have developed an air defense system that is capable of shooting down hypersonic missiles. And of course, there's a lot of discussion and rumor and speculation about how many of these systems Russia has. All I will repeat and say again is that I read a few weeks ago in TASS a claim from the head of Rostec that Russia has greatly increased production of these systems. So undoubtedly they have significantly more, if you believe that report, which I do, than they did at the outset of the war. And I suspect we will be seeing them in greater numbers before very long. By the way, whilst I'm talking about Russian production numbers, there was a very interesting article in The Economist talking about Russian tank production. It claimed that the Ural Vagon Zavod factory can produce 20 tanks, new-built tanks, presumably T-90Ms a month, and can modernize around 40 older tanks, refurbish 40 older tanks a month. Now, that works out at 240 tanks a year, 240 new tanks a year, and around 500 refurbished tanks a year. Not that far from the figure of 1,000 tanks, new and refurbished, that was being talked about a short time ago. The Economist, which I think is taking its information from the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which is very strongly opposed to the Putin government, appears, however, to believe that Russia has only one tank factory, which is Ural Vagon Zavod, which is located in the Ural city of Nizhny Tagil. Russia actually has two tank factories. There's another tank factory in Omsk, which the head of the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and former prime minister, who is now also the deputy chair of Russia's Military Industrial Commission. Anyway, Medvedev also visited the Omsk factory. The Omsk factory used to produce T-80 tanks. It went into a kind of hibernation for a significant period in the 1990s and 2000s, but it was never completely closed down. And over the last couple of years, before the conflict in Ukraine started, it resumed work on the T-80 project. It started to refurbish old T-80 tanks for the Russian military, the T-80 being the preferred tank of the Russian naval infantry, the Marines, and it's also a tank which Russian units in the Arctic prefer. to the T-72 and the T-90 because its gas turbine engine can work much better in extremely low temperatures. So, almost certainly, the Omsk factory, as it had visited by Medvedev, is now busy refurbishing more of these old T-80 tanks. And if you add the work that Omsk is doing to the work that The Economist and I believe Novaya Gazeta are saying Uralvagon Zavod is doing with T-90s and T-72s, you can easily get to 1,000 new and rebuilt tanks a year. Now, that may not sound a lot, but it's significantly more than the number of tanks that Ukraine is going to receive from the West by even the most optimistic calculations. So just saying, we're looking about 200 tanks from the West over the course of this entire year. And Novaya Gazeta and the Economist tell us that Russia, Uralvagon Zavod by itself will be providing the Russian military with 240 entirely new tanks this year, which is more than the number of tanks Ukraine is likely to get from the West. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I anyway distrust these figures. I'm pretty sure that they're based on pre-war assessments of Russian tank production rates. I'm pretty sure that by now the Russians will have increased production of tanks beyond this level and significantly beyond this level, just as they have increased artillery shell production and production of infantry fighting vehicles and production of aircraft, Sukhoi 35s and Sukhoi 30s and Sukhoi 57s, and of course production of missiles. So, just saying. Anyway, let's move on, because there's also been some really very interesting, in fact, extremely interesting information from this same correspondent who discussed the Patriot missile and its weaknesses for me. And this is about the Nord Stream affair and the 6 guys and about hypothesis. And this correspondent is in a particularly strong position to discuss this information because, as well as being a technical person who is very familiar with all the topics I've been talking about, and I'm not going to say more than that because again, I want to stress these are private emails. He's also somebody who has interest and knowledge of yachting and boats. And I'm going to say straight away that he's discussed in very extensive detail the constraints of diving from the kind of yacht that's been displayed in the various photographs. He's very helpfully provided me with pictures of a similar yacht that he has personal knowledge of, and he gives me some pictures of the interiors. And again, I'm going to say straightforwardly that it is impossible, I think I can say now definitely, that it is impossible to carry out the kind of operation described from a yacht like this. I mean, the idea is not just absurd, it is beyond absurd. It is fantastical. Now, I noticed that The Guardian, apparently quoting Der Spiegel today, actually admits this. It's the first Western media outlet that I've seen that has finally faced up to the utter implausibility of the 6 guys and a boat story. But of course, rather than drop that hypothesis, it's now speculating that perhaps more than one boat was involved. So we see how the story is buckling, it's collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, and in order to make it more plausible, you have to now add new elements to it. So it's not just 6 guys and 1 boat, it's 2 boats and perhaps some more guys. I'm going to say straight away, however many of these boats, if we're talking about the same kind of yachts, however many of these boats it is alleged were used, based on the information I've seen, based on the photographs I've seen, my own personal opinion as an inexpert person is that these boats are completely inappropriate for an operation of this kind. And even if there was a whole flotilla of them conducting this kind of operation, it would still be impossible. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. As I said, I'd be interested to see whether anybody's arrested, whether there's brought in for questioning, whether there's questions asked. I'm seeing lots of commentary about this 6 guys in a boat circulating in the non-Western media, which appears skeptical to say the least. There's some suggestions even that this is such an absurd story that the Germans must feel embarrassed that they're being dragged into essentially colluding with it. Well, there we go. I don't know how embarrassed the Germans are. But anyway, I think that overall what this story has done is that it's actually given more traction to Seymour Hersh's account of the matter. That's my own view. Anyway, let's now turn to other topics. Let's focus on the really big news, which is this diplomatic breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, in my program yesterday, I mentioned that President Putin of Russia had had a discussion with President Raisi of Iran. It was not a very informative readout that the Kremlin provided to us, but we also got news that Iran has now sealed a deal with the Russians to buy Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, and I wondered what the Saudi reaction to that would be. Well, I think we can now say that clearly the fighter jet delivery, the Sukhoi 35 fighter jet delivery, is part of this overall package, which has resulted in this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, there's been a joint statement by Saudi Arabia and Iran. They express enormous gratitude to Xi Jinping and the Chinese government for mediating this agreement. They thank the governments of the United Arab Emirates and Iraq for hosting earlier discussions. And the fact that these 2 governments, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have published a joint statement of this sort is suggestive in itself. Now, I don't know all the details of this deal, but as Alex Christoforou and I discussed in our program yesterday, this is clearly more than just a deal to re-establish diplomatic relations which were severed 7 years ago and to reopen embassies. It clearly goes far beyond that. And we see that the Sukhoi 35 delivery is part of it. It must be part of it. The Russians were not exercising the mediation. They weren't directly involved in the mediation themselves, but they were there on the sidelines, undoubtedly aware what was going on, and in fact being carefully kept in the loop by the Chinese and the Iranians and no doubt the Saudis. So the Russians would have known all about this. And as I said, this deal between Iran and Russia to supply these Su-35s was clearly an element of this whole agreement. The Saudis will have agreed to that fighter jet delivery as part of this deal. They will have lifted their objections to this fighter jet delivery, which they previously had and which previously acted as the single most important restraint on Russian military equipment deliveries to Iran. And there will also have been lots of other deals, not all of which so far we can fully guess. But I'm going to make a further speculation that alongside the Sukhoi 35s, we are probably going to see Russian S-400 air defense missile systems turning up, I'm going to guess, in both Iran and in Saudi Arabia. And the Iranians have been talking about this, and I remember that some years ago when King Salman, the father of MBS and the current king of Saudi Arabia, when he visited Moscow, I can remember that at that time there were already discussions underway for the supply by Russia of S-400 missiles to Saudi Arabia. So I'm going to guess that the Russians are going to supply Su-35s and S-400 missile systems to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, and at the very least, they're also going to supply S-400 missile systems to the Saudis, and also they'll be providing the same, much of the same kit, the radars, the associated equipment that goes with them, and apparently it's possible to integrate these systems, these S-400 systems, so in a way, in a kind of communications and control mechanism that enables officials in Moscow, military officials in Moscow, to see what the radars and other guidance systems, search systems of these S-400s are seeing. And so, certainly in the case of Iran, perhaps not in the case of Saudi Arabia, it means that the Russians are now probably going to have some kind of means to keep track of what is going on around Iranian airspace. Now, it might not be entirely straightforward. Iran is a huge country, and it's also very mountainous, which must interfere to some extent, at least, with radar systems. But anyway, it seems to me that what we're probably going to see over the next few years is a steady evolution in Iran's air defenses to an entirely new level, far beyond that which Iran has at present, making it increasingly difficult for third countries, the United States, Israel, to launch attacks on Iran. Now, the Iranians will have had to make significant concessions in return for this. And I'm going to say straight away that I'm sure that the Saudis will have insisted that Iran should not develop a nuclear weapon. And I suspect that the Iranian nuclear weapons program, which of course the Iranians categorically denied ever existed, well, that nuclear program is probably now ended. I'm going to say what I think here, which is that I think it has now served its purpose. I don't think Iran ever intended to acquire nuclear weapons to attack Israel. I think that the Iranians know perfectly well that that would be utterly irrational and completely self-destructive. It would invite an overwhelming nuclear retaliation against Iran. I don't think that was ever the Iranian plan. I think that originally, my own personal view is that Iran did have in the past a nuclear weapons program. That was in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think that it conducted that nuclear weapons program not in order to threaten Israel or let alone the United States, but to protect itself from Saddam Hussein, who at the time of the first war between the United States and Iraq in 1991, it was established, had a nuclear weapons program which had come very close to producing a viable nuclear weapon. Now, given that the Iranians had fought a very difficult war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 1980s, I can entirely understand why the Iranians at that time would not have wanted to be without a nuclear weapon in case Saddam Hussein found a way to develop one of his own. I also believe, and this is consistent with what US intelligence has been saying, that the Iranian nuclear program was shelved when Saddam Hussein was overthrown. I don't think there has been an effective, a coherent Iranian nuclear weapon at any point since then. But what the Iranians have done is that they've played a game of enriching uranium up to a certain level at various times in order to obtain diplomatic leverage. Firstly, over the United States, who they drew into the negotiations, which eventually led to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the joint JCPOA, which led to sanctions being lifted. And more recently, and I think this is perhaps a point which many people haven't fully understood, to provide Iran with some leverage over the Saudis. And now that this rapprochement with the Saudis has been achieved, I think Iran doesn't need that leverage anymore. And I think that, as I said, whatever plans there were to keep this enrichment program, active, well, perhaps they won't be shelved. They might still be used for leverage over the United States. But I no longer believe that there is any real risk that it will ever result in a nuclear bomb. So that's the first thing to say, a nuclear capability. I think Iran and Saudi Arabia have agreed about this. I think the Saudis do not want Iran, for obvious reasons, to acquire nuclear weapons. I think the Russians and the Chinese don't want to see it either. From the Iranian point of view, the leverage has achieved its purpose. They no longer need to press on with nuclear enrichment, or at least if they are going to press on with nuclear enrichment, it will be the same kind of game. I don't believe it will ever result in a nuclear weapon from this point on. Now, I think also that there will have been some kind of an agreement about Yemen. It's difficult to know exactly what that agreement is, but I'm going to make a guess that the Iranians will have agreed to lean on the Houthis in Yemen to moderate perhaps some of their demands on the Saudis. The Saudis will have accepted that the war in Yemen must end anyway. There will clearly be some attempt to unlock the problems in the Yemen war, which may be coming towards a conclusion. And I've already discussed how in the program that we did with Alex Christoforou, that the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is another big step towards the end of the Syrian war. We saw the Egyptian foreign minister going to Damascus a short time ago. I would have thought that steps to bring that war to an end, to bring Syria back into the Arab fold, will now accelerate. And we will see a genuine stabilization in the Middle East, where the situation, to be frank, was destabilized, severely destabilized, as a result of the US invasion of Iraq way back in 2003, with all the many wars and conflicts which have followed since then. So that's, I think, a few things that I'm going to say about this deal. But of course, the biggest story of all, and the most important one, and the one that it's essential not to lose sight of, is that the Chinese were the key mediators. Now, this has never happened before in recent history where a country other than the United States has acted as the main mediator in a conflict and has acted to resolve an international conflict. As I discussed in the program that we did on the Duran, in 1965, the Soviets brokered what was a temporary peace between India and Pakistan following a brief war that was fought between those two countries. But this was not a genuine peace. It was more like a kind of extended ceasefire. And in fact, within a few years, in 1971, India and Pakistan were back at war with each other. There have been various other Russian diplomatic initiatives since then. The Russians affected the Astana process with Turkey and Iran, which sought to bring peace to Syria, and it's been a fairly successful process, but it's never been fully completed, and it's, anyway, a process which Russia did not conduct by itself. Turkey and Iran, by definition, were also involved. And of course, the Russians have also tried, with mixed results, to mediate some kind of peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I suspect over time they will probably, to some extent, be successful in that. But notice that the Western powers are trying to interfere in that process. They're trying to sort of win over the Armenians, pull them away from the Russians. Don't think that will be successful overall and in the long term. But I think that is what they will probably try. You know, that mediation process also has not yet reached its full successful end. No one else, apart from the United States, has carried out a mediation like this between two conflicting powers. The Israelis and the Palestinians spoke to each other in Oslo and came to an agreement there. They kept the United States at bay whilst they were negotiating it. There were various teams of mediators involved from other countries. Again, the United States subsequently, however, was able to insert itself into the process, which is one reason, in my opinion, why it's again failed to produce any permanent results. But in this instance, one country, China, has apparently seen the whole process through, and that, to my knowledge, is the first time this has happened. And this is a diplomatic earthquake. There is the diplomatic revolution that's happening within the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia realigning, moving closer to the Eurasian powers, to China, Russia. In our program on the Duran, we discussed the importance of this for the future of the petrodollar, the position of the dollar as a reserve currency, all of those things. But perhaps the even bigger story is that China is now fulfilling that role of mediator of conflicts, which up to now has been the almost exclusive prerogative of the United States. Now, one cannot see that as anything other than the dawn of a new era in diplomatic history. It means that the Chinese are now doing, and doing successfully, something which the United States, as the world's most powerful country, as the global hegemon, if you will, was previously the only one that was able to do. And it also means that countries like Saudi Arabia, a historic US ally, and Iran now prefer to go to China as the preferred mediator over the United States. Now, this ought to be alarming for US leaders, because when a country starts to fulfill the kind of role that China does, it's no longer just a rival, it's beginning to look like a successor to the United States as the preeminent global power. Why else would countries go to a third country and ask it to act as a mediator in these sort of disputes if they didn't think that it either was the preeminent power or would become so fairly soon? So this is, as I said, a diplomatic revolution, both in terms of the situation in the Middle East, both in terms of the future direction of the world economy and perhaps the international status of the dollar, something we discussed at length in that video on the Duran, but also in the relative positions of China and the United States in the world. And I have to say that not only should this alarm US leaders, but there's good reasons to think that they are alarmed. And one of the facts which suggests to me how alarmed they actually are is the insignificant attention that this story is receiving, this a huge event is receiving in much of the Western media. The British media has tucked it away as a sort of story very much on the sort of lower part of the headlines. It's scarcely the big story in the British media. A few paragraphs tucked away in various parts of the media. The Guardian, for example, has barely covered it. The big story in Britain at the moment, by the way, is the sacking, or rather not the sacking, the forced withdrawal of a footballer who provides football commentary on Match of the Day. That's a much bigger story than a diplomatic revolution of the kind that we are talking about. And anyway, that's perhaps an extreme case. But, and, you know, I'll accept that for some people, football is the single most important thing. But anyway, the fact is, if you go to the British media, you could easily overlook this story. And the same is true, as far as I can see, across the entire media of the West. It's as if nobody wants to see this. Because nobody wants to see the obvious facts about the Nord Stream pipeline affair. Nobody wants to see that there's just been a huge diplomatic revolution in the Middle East. And it was the reason they don't want to see it is because this is so deeply unsettling for them. It's something that causes them a great deal of concern and trouble and worry. And as I said, so it should. And let me say again, it is the sign of things to come. In my opinion, this isn't just a case of a diplomatic revolution with China mediating one dispute. It is perhaps the strongest sign that we've seen up to now, that the period of unchallenged US hegemony, global hegemony, has now conclusively ended, and that a multipolar world with China perhaps now assuming the leading role has begun. Now, before I finish this video, I want to just touch on one particular point which follows from my video yesterday. Now, yesterday I discussed China, Chinese policies, and various aspects of what the Chinese have been doing, and I've been discussing it actually over the course of several days. And a lot of people have asked me, they've commented on the fact that I've spoken at length about Xinjiang and his very strong statements about the United States, and they say that I'm overlooking the equally harsh words directed at the United States by China's President Xi Jinping. Well, the words that people are referring to were used by Xi Jinping in a meeting of business leaders, and Xi Jinping delivered his fairly lengthy speech there, and the words that people are focusing on are these. The external environment for our country's development has changed rapidly, and uncertain and unpredictable factors have increased significantly. In particular, Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-round containment and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development. That's it. That's all Xi Jinping said. Now, these are entirely factual words. All you have to do is read any Western publication that considers international relations and the US's global policy, and you will find any number of articles and discussions about the containment of China. And of course, we've had the microchip ban and all kinds of other bans, restrictions that have been placed on China, and which are openly discussed as intended to limit China's economic development. So Xi Jinping makes what I think is a very mild, factual statement stating the obvious, stating what the Western media has said. It does refer to the United States, but we all know that it's the United States that's doing this. And people say that these are incredibly harsh comments about the United States from Xi Jinping, and we have any number of articles appearing in the Western media telling us as much. Well, I don't find this statement remarkable at all harsh. I find it, as I said, purely factual. If you want a harsh statement, you want to see what a harsh statement looks like, go back to President Biden's State of the Union address, where he said things about Xi Jinping, which I personally thought were deeply insulting, and which I suspect Xi Jinping and many Chinese people would think were insulting also. With all the appearance of being angry, President Biden asked rhetorically which world leader would want them to be in the place of Xi Jinping. And this came after all kinds of comments about the United States leading the struggle of the democracies against the autocracies. Those kind of comments, those kind of deeply abusive and insulting comments about China's president, well, they're unremarkable coming from the President of the United States, and nobody apparently thinks they're harsh. A statement of fact, a statement of the obvious from the Chinese president, by contrast, is seen as harsh and spoken about in that way by the Western media. Is it surprising that the Chinese feel themselves to be under pressure and are building up their alliances and are looking for friends? Well, that's all I'm going to say today in this program. There'll be more from me soon. There'll be no doubt a lot more about the situation in Bakhmut over the next couple of hours. As I was making this video, I saw a report which said that Prigozhin now says that the Wagner forces are closing in on the center of Bakhmut. It could be that the Russians are expecting to capture the whole of Bakhmut within a couple of days, perhaps before this Ukrainian counterattack gets going. Well, we'll see. But anyway, that's something for another day. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me just remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Links under this video. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video also. Don't forget to check out our shop. Links under this video too. You'll find all sorts of great things there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and all those fine things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.